Tonight I want to begin by discussing another crucial component of the conceptual level of consciousness. That is, the use of language, of words, in one's thinking. You will remember that in my lecture on psychoepistemology in the Basic Principles of Objectivism course, I asked you to try an experiment. I asked you to take any idea of yours which you were convinced was true, and for which you knew the proof, and to try to prove it in your own minds, but without the use of any words whatever in your thought process. You'll remember that you could not do it. You could not form or retain your thoughts in consciousness. You could not order them in a logical progression. You could not front seat drive without the use of words. And the consequence of attempting to think without language was that you went out of focus. Your mind went blank. Without language, there is no way to sustain a thinking process. It is language that is the cardinal tool of thought. To think conceptually, to be on the conceptual level of consciousness, is to think in words. Language is the means by which man denotes and works with concepts. It's the means by which he retains and holds his concepts in his mind. Without language, he can neither initiate or sustain a process of conceptual problem solving. I have said that the conceptual level of consciousness requires that one form concepts consciously, that one know when one is forming a concept or reaching a conclusion, and that one know what concept and what conclusion. I could rephrase this to say the conceptual level of consciousness requires that one formulate one's ideas in words. Either one knows and is conscious of what abstractions or principles one is drawing from what concretes, which means that one verbalizes those abstractions, or one draws abstractions in the manner I discussed last week, that is, by association, by emotion, by the memory of concrete experiences. In all the examples of associational thinking that we have discussed, the common denominator was the failure of the person to know that he was accepting a certain abstraction or principle. And what abstraction or principle? The man who was watching the television play about the physicist and his family didn't consciously know that he was accepting a philosophical view of man. The girl who disliked red-haired women didn't know that she was accepting the doctrine that physical attributes determine character. Had they formulated the meaning of the events they observed conceptually in words, instead of simply reacting emotionally and filing their experiences in their subconscious as concretes, they could not have made the errors they did make. No one would permit himself to say, "This red-haired teacher hurt me by treating me unjustly. This red-haired girl hurt me by behaving irrationally. I think the essence of what they have in common and what caused them to behave in this manner is the color of their hair. Therefore, I conclude that all red-haired people are dangerous and not to be trusted." One can only accept such an idea by failing to verbalize it in one's own mind. If thinking in words you do make an error and come to a false conclusion, you still have the means to correct the error, because you know what idea you have accepted and upon what facts and observations you based it. It is to the extent that you do not use language in your thinking, do not formulate concepts in words, that you're at the mercy of chance, of your subconscious, of your stale thinking, of irrational associations, of emotional overgeneralizations. A common alternative to thinking in words, the methodology of the backseat driver, is to substitute emotions and images for language in the process of problem solving. Associational thinking consists precisely of the storing of emotions and images, mental pictures of events. rather than the conceptualized, verbalized meaning of those events. The backseat driver will wander mentally from one image to another, from one emotion to another, from one memory to another, with his mental process only now and then interspersed with words. Words will enter into his thinking only at random intervals, never in a connected logical progression. The result is that his thinking has no connected logical progression. Stored in his subconscious is a collection of pictures and emotions, and when he attempts to think about any present issue, his mental process is dominated by that collection of pictures and emotions, thrown to him from his subconscious, and by the use of images and emotions in his present conscious thinking. To quote again from my lecture in the Basic Principles of Objectivism course, when people speak to each other, they normally do not intersperse between their sentences picture sketches and reports on their random emotions. If they did attempt such interspersions, they would not be understood. But most people do not treat their own minds with the respect they grant to the minds of others. They assume that for themselves, any chaotic hodgepodge is good enough, unquote. It is as though they attempt in their own minds to form a syllogism by introducing as the first premise a verbalized statement of fact. Then they paint a mental picture which is intended to represent the second premise. Then they try to derive a conclusion from the union of the concept and the picture. But it cannot be done. Whatever conclusion they may reach, it will not have been derived from that union. A picture is not a concept. An emotion is not a concept. The memory of a concrete event is not a concept. Thinking, conceptual thinking, begins only with the employment of language. Let me illustrate this by quoting from one of the papers that was handed in to me, one of the transcripts of the students' thought processes in answer to the statement I made to you at the beginning of the first lecture, the statement, "You are not always honest." The first part of this paper reads, quote, "You are not always honest. In what respect? What happened in the office last week? How I acted. Is that an act of dishonesty?" Unquote. Apparently this person pictured in his mind whatever it was that happened in the office last week, then asked himself if it was an act of dishonesty. In the paper he arrived at no conclusion one way or another. There was no means by which he could arrive at any conclusion. How could he answer the question, how could he know, without discovering and naming the conceptual meaning of the event in question? Just looking at the event, simply re-seeing it in the form of a picture, could never tell him if the act was honest or dishonest. Only a conceptualized, verbalized process of thought could do that. Only the most primitive kinds of mental processes are possible without the use of words. One can visualize moving a chair across a room, but one cannot perform any complex thought process, which requires the use of concepts, the relating and integrating of concepts, the use of inference, of deduction, the drawing and application of principles, the grasping of essentials, the holding of a wide context without the use of language. You might be able to project the idea the cat is on the mat by mentally visualizing a drawing of a cat on a mat. You might project the idea that someone is cold by visualizing him shivering and putting on warm clothes. But you could not grasp the nature and importance of a focused consciousness, or understand what a concept is, or form the idea that man's life should be the standard of value of a moral code by means of mental pictures. Now there is obviously some form of subverbal mental activity in which man does engage, and in which he necessarily engages. If there were no such phenomenon as subverbal thinking, by which I don't mean the use of emotions and images, we could not account for the fact that man ever learned to use language.